Hi, this is Horace Cordier, and you're watching Rockin' Hard Place. And this episode tonight is our Defend Your Album segment. And this is where we take what we consider to be an overlooked or not properly appreciated recording, sometimes a controversial record from a band's catalog, and talk about why we love it and what we love about it. So tonight we're going to discuss Crimson Glory's Strange and Beautiful, which is their controversial third album after two sort of acknowledged power metal classics. So let's start with, we're here with my friend John and Anton, and I think we're going to let Anton start on this one. So Anton, what would be the first thing that you would say to a prospective listener about this album?
So this is the third album from Crimson Glory. First two being the self-titled and the second one being Transcendence, both generally acknowledged as really incredible progressive power metal albums. Both albums have like really memorable songs, like from Valhalla on the first album and the really commercial Lonely on Transcendence, which I really love. But this album, Strange and Beautiful, is kind of odd when compared to the last two because it has a far more hard rock, Led Zeppelin kind of feel to it. And the introduction to this album lets you know that it's going to be different, like from the first song, Strange and Beautiful, where it has this hard rock vibe, but it maintains this like song structure and guitar riffing that are reminiscent of the last two, but let you know that you're in for something different. Like right from the outset, it's definitely not trying to be the last two albums, which I think make it a lot more appreciable than people give it credit to be, because they're trying to take some risks and do something different. And I think it's wonderful. And you can, whoever wants to jump in can jump in, how their initial feelings on the album is.
So I was going to ask John. John and I were able to talk about this a little bit on the. We were talking about this a little on the phone, prior to the recording of the album, because of the three of us, I probably spent the least amount of time with the Crimson Glory catalog. Not by any particular reason. It's just I listen to so much music that certain bands sort of slip through the cracks. And the thing for me with Crimson Glory is I was familiar with the first two albums. Hadn't spent as much time with them as I would have liked, but was not as familiar at all with Strange and Beautiful. So it's very interesting to me as sort of more of a newbie with this album, which I heard many years ago and liked, to listen to it and be able to listen to it after spending a lot of time with the first two albums and putting sort of the three together. And the thing that I noticed most about this record, and then I'm going to turn it over to John for a minute, is I was joking around calling it Strange and Zeppelin. There is a lot of Led Zeppelin on this record, and it's in a really interesting way that I like, which is it's not the cock rocking, whole lot of love, the Zeppelin that everybody thinks of. It's the very interesting, more heavy acoustic. There's some really beautiful like guitar tapestries, especially on like the title track. And Midnight has this sort of natural, he has an amazing voice, but he has this natural kind of like ability to slip into a more earthy kind of tone. So that's what I found interesting about it, was just hearing it through that sort of Zeppelin prism, which I happen to love that sound. So it works incredibly well for me, but I could also see why after, things like these storming, like power metal of like Valhalla, or, these really great power metal ballads like Heart of Steel, that, listeners back in the day might have been like, whoa, what the hell is this? John, thoughts?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting about this album. It really, so for them, it's their first album and their only album when they were signed to Atlantic. And for me, it really does sound like a band sort of wrestling with a sort of a major label release. You see this with a lot of artists that sort of come from the underground, and then they're sort of all this attention and spotlight is put on them, and then they're sort of forced to sort of navigate these sort of treacherous waters. And the title is actually a reference to the fact that this was originally supposed to be a double album. It was supposed to be The Strange was the new hard rock melodic direction, or rather the heavy part was the Strange, was the older sort of style, and the Beautiful was this new, as both of you so correctly categorized it, this almost like Zeppelin-esque hard rock direction. Reportedly, Midnight was very much influenced by these kinds of 70s bands, and he was the one who was really pushing for this kind of new sound. It sort of reminds me, when I read stories about Iron Maiden and after Power Slave, after the World Slavery Tour, Bruce Dickinson wanted to move that band into that kind of a direction. He was like, we have to do our physical graffiti, right? We have to do our masterpiece. And then Steve Harris reportedly was like, no, we have to go and continue on our sort of metal path. And this sort of represents a band really trying to do that. And the label was not interested in any sort of really underground heavy material. So a lot of that material that was written was actually cut from the album. The album was not a double album, it's a single album, although it is about an hour long. And some of those tracks actually would wind up on their follow-up Astronomica. But basically you have the guitarist Ben Jackson leaves the band reportedly very frustrated with the new direction. And Dana Burnell, the original drummer, leaves, and you have Ravi Jacodia as the new drummer. And yeah, I could only sort of echo the sort of things that you both have been saying. I mean, I really, really like this album. One of the reasons why I think maybe it didn't really find the audience it did is because this first single, The Chant, is this kind of really poppy number with sort of female backing vocals. It sort of like verges on the edge of like a glam kind of sound, although it's not very representative of the rest of the album. But it's sort of that to me, which actually has an outside songwriter, Marty Fredrickson, who would also co-write for bands like Aerosmith and Ozzy. You could really feel like this is an attempt to sort of do a crossover hit. And that probably turned off a lot of older fans who were not sort of willing to sort of go along with this kind of sound. And also that kind of a sound for that single. This is right as grunge is sort of making waves. So it felt sort of kind of late to the train, so to speak, with that sound.
Yeah,
It didn't represent the album well.
Yeah, there's a lot going on. Also, as you know, someone that was very fond of a lot of records during that period. There was a very strange period commercially in terms of the artistic landscape that you were dealing with, because you had major labels sort of sniffing blood in the water, thinking they were going to make a fortune on every power metal and thrash metal band. And by '91, the wheels were slightly coming off the train. So, you know, this was an era where, you know, they were like, major labels were signing bands like Cycle Sluts from Hell and, you know, things, and thinking, you know, they were going to sell bucket loads of records, all in the frame of the Metallica thing. And so I think Crimson Glory were a pickup from Roadrunner, I believe. And so they probably wanted them to sort of adjust their sound, you know, thinking that, you know, there was going to be this sort of more commercial thing. And as I understand it, the record didn't sell particularly well. As a matter of fact, I don't think it even sold as well as the independent albums that preceded it. But weirdly, having listened to all three in a row recently, in some ways it may be the most timeless of the three, with the widest appeal because of the Zeppelin elements, and it's very well produced record as well.
Yeah.
Anton?
I agree. Also, listening to this album reminds me of a road trip that John and I had gone on.
Nice.
And we were listening to this album for whatever reason. And this was like, what, maybe 10 years ago or something like that. And we were listening to it. And we both were of the mind that this album's really good, but maybe 15 minutes too long, right? I think I figured out why we came to that conclusion. Is because the last three songs in the album, Deep Inside Your Heart, Make You Love Me, and Far Away, are very confusing for the last three songs of the album. Deep Inside Your Heart could have been an album closer, and then Make You Love Me is an upbeat song, and then it goes back downbeat for Far Away. All these songs very good, but in that order,
Right.
it was down tempo, then up tempo, then down tempo. It makes you kind of in a place like, oh, is this album really ending now? And it's leaving on an inconclusive note that is probably the biggest fault of this album. Uh, at the end of the day, though, I'm appreciative that we have these 3 songs rather than them ending up on the end of the cutting room floor.
Right. And on top of everything else, what happens is, like a lot of things, because one of the things we're going to be dealing with a lot in this show is reissues and older material. Crimson Glory's entire catalog, about 10 years ago, was reissued by Polish label Metal Mind, and they threw some bonus tracks on there. So when I was listening to either a Transcendence or one of the first two, what's the album that has Lonely on it? Well,
That's Transcendence.
Transcendence. There's just an arbitrary remix thrown on as a bonus track, because I mean all of the Metal Mind reissues except for the first album had bonus tracks. So it's sort of like, oh well, didn't I just hear the song? So one of the things that happened back in the day and still is an issue is it used to be something that you really had to pay attention to was when it was vinyl, was your track order was like a crucial thing. But now with the way people consume music on iPods and playlists and whatever, it's not the same thing. But I mean, there was a time when you sat down as a band and said, what's going to be the album opener? What's going to be the album closer? What's going to open side 2? And, you know, there are many great albums that were often suffered because they had track sequencing that didn't work. So what Anton is talking about is it's probably, you could have sequenced that album differently and it would have been more effective.
I just want to jump in and talk about like a couple of songs I really love. I mean, I really love the song In the Mood, which to me sort of exemplifies a little bit of this new approach when it works, right? It's a nice interplay between these kind of bluesy riffs and these like nice acoustic passages. And of course, at the end, there's a saxophone solo, which comes in, which is completely unexpected. And it sort of works wonderfully. I mean, it's a really gutsy kind of song. I really appreciate it. Probably my favorite song on the album is Star Chamber. That's got a real epic feel to it. Very melodically interesting. We've used this word a lot, but Zeppelin. I mean, this is basically like a Zeppelin song. I mean,
Kashmir.
I think that influence.
Very Kashmir.
And then also, Anton just mentioned it, but Deep Inside Your Heart is this sort of great power ballad that harkens to the Transcendence era of the band. Crimson Glory had this knack for these kind of really great sort of power ballads. I'm thinking of songs like Painted Skies, Heart of Steel off the debut. I mean, they had a really great way of being dramatic and melodically interesting without sort of being sort of cheesy. And Deep Inside Your Heart for me is sort of like one of these tracks that sort of buried as it is on the sort of the end of the album. That's usually where sort of lesser songs are kind of relegated to, but I actually think that's one of the strongest songs on the album. So
yeah, usually
great material.
It's a sort of that third quarter, what I call the third quarter drag, where it's sort of, if an album tends to falter, it tends to usually be strong at the beginning, and most bands sort of focus on ending strong, but then sometimes that's 75% in areas when you run into problems, especially with the longer albums. But yeah, no, In the Mood is fantastic, and it's a strange song. And that's
Is it also beautiful?
It's also beautiful, yes. So it's funny because as I was listening to the record much more closely this time, is just the tapestries of those tracks and the unexpected elements, like having a saxophone solo, which is not something that you can often get away with. I know Golden Earring were able to do it a couple times, or that was a flute maybe. But the sax is, what, Foreigner, Urgent? I mean, how many rock and roll numbers do we, like, off the top of our head go, oh, that's a saxophone? So good for them on that. And I just did want to quickly mention that it's tragic that he's no longer with us, but a huge part of what makes the album so great is Midnight, who has one of the most amazing voices from this era. And he was unique. I mean, he was kind of a little bit of, I don't know how to describe his voice. It's sort of like maybe a cleaner Halford. There's a little Freddie Mercury in there. I don't know. But he has a really nice natural tone and an effortless ability to hit some pretty impressive notes without cracking it. And he's never strained it.
Yeah, I'd say it's kind of a raspy, higher pitched range. Don't usually mix so much, but it makes for a nice, a different sounding voice. Like, I don't think you could cite too many people that sound like Midnight.
No, I don't think. I think he definitely has a unique voice. And honestly, the band has a unique, especially on this album, they have a unique musical presence. And they did do another album after this called Astronomica, but it's not the same lineup. So what we're really talking about is the Midnight era. which is these three albums. And this is the one that has not gotten the attention that it deserves.
Well, Anton, you were talking about bands that were influenced by Crimson Glory, which
Yeah, that would be interesting to hear, because I haven't really thought about that. Are there any bands you could think of more recent vintage that have been influenced by Crimson Glory?
Recently, well, you can listen to a lot of like power prog metal bands, and then you could hear stuff going back to like Crimson Glory and Queensryche and other similar bands like that. But one band really stood out to me as having, I can't cite that they're definitely influenced, but if you listen to the band called Conception, which put out a bunch of albums in the early to late 90s, and just recently came out with another one. Particularly the albums Parallel Minds and In Your Multitude.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the riffing sounds like it was directly influenced, not only from this band, but also this album.
Interesting. I have heard of Conception. And they're that's interesting. So you definitely hear, and I'm sure if I dug more into, if I was a little bit more knowledgeable on some of the more recent power and progressive metal bands, I would be shocked if there has not been some influence from the Crimson Glory, the Midnight Crimson Glory.
Oh, pioneers for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're coming up on the last couple of minutes. So is there anything you guys would like to say to sort of wrap this up? I would just say that it's a shame to me that this album is kind of out of print now, and it needs, a lot of things have like popped up for proper reissues recently, and these reissues now are 10 years older. So I really hope one of these labels out here, HNE or something, Cherry Red, I'm talking to you, get off the case and put these albums back up. And that's pretty much my final word on this strange and beautiful record. John and Anton, is there anything else you'd like to add?
Yeah, I mean, I just want to, because I was sort of going down the rabbit hole and sort of instead of preparing for the show, I was unaware of the fact that there was actually 2 offshoots from Crimson Glory around this time period. I just want to sort of cite them because they're kind of interesting, sort of
by all means, yes,
adjacent sort of albums to sort of listen to. I mentioned Ben Jackson before leaving the band because he was unhappy with the musical direction. So he put out an album in 1995 called Perish. The band is called Perish. The album is called Envision. It's basically like more of the old school 80s Crimson, sort of like Queensryche, Fate's Warning kind of sound.
Mm-hmm.
So they did a one and done. And then similarly, basically the Strange and Beautiful lineup minus Midnight, basically with vocalist David Van Landing, put out an album in 1996 called Erotic Liquid Culture. And of course, that singer would go on to do a live album with Michael Schenker Group. And it basically takes the Strange and Beautiful sound and pushes it into more like a funk kind of metal direction. So it's like continuing that sort of hard rock vein. And just to finish out, I mean, I really like the mix of different styles on this album. It's adventurous in a way that I really have come to appreciate from a lot of metal acts that, yes, they had made their sort of, their career and their success was sort of based on really crystallizing and perfecting this really great sort of 80s progressive power sound, and they're really good at that. But I really appreciate all of the different types of textures, approaches, and influences that they sort of put into this record. So I just want to say that I really like it for the fact that it strives to do something different and push the sound forward. So that's what I have to say.
Anton?
I'll echo John there. I really appreciate the risks that this band took on this album. As John had mentioned also that there was some kind of gospel backup on a few songs. And it was definitely outside of a comfort zone, probably of more to the fault of the listeners rather than the band themselves in the band's execution. The band put something out, and the listeners, I'd say, just weren't used to Crimson Glory sounding this way. So immediately they kind of just wrote it off, and which is a shame, because this album has overall maybe my favorite effort that they put out, everything considering.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting, and I think like writers with writing or any other art form, sometimes if you're too close to something, you can't quite get a really good handle on it. And I know there was some internal strife in the band over the change of direction, but weirdly enough, having listened to the 3 albums all fairly close together, I think this is the one that has a surprising amount of staying power and is still very relevant today. So um, I just echoing also what both of you have said. I think this is a really terrific record, really ripe for rediscovery. And I would suggest that anyone that likes hard rock, and you might not even be like much of a power metal person, and you might really like this record. So by all means, you can find streams and things. The album is available for download on Amazon if you want it. But you know, by all means, you should definitely check this album out. Strange and Beautiful Crimson Glory. And this has been an episode of Rock and Hard Place. And we will see you again soon. Have a good night, everyone. John, Anton, thanks for coming,
Good night.
and good night.